Now we are going to talk about how to configure Snmp version 3. We're going to talk about views, ENGINEID, groups, users, and a particular Cisco Snmp feature that is known as support for VPNs, that is also known as VPN context-based access control. What are the steps in order to configure version 3? Optionally configuring views, optionally configuring an ENGINEID, and the minimal configuration will be creating at least one group with at least one user belonging to this group. The minimal settings for the group will be the security level. The configuration for the user that belongs to this group must match this security level. More on this later. Now, the best practice or recommended way to configure version 3 will include, for instance, configuring views. With views, we are going to grant permissions to a group and therefore to all users within that group. Is it going to be a read-only group? Is it going to be a read and write group? Is it going to be a group that will receive notifications? We must always configure an access control list for a group, and we have the option of configuring access control lists for particular users. So let's talk about views. Remember that with views we can grant read access, write access, and notifications for groups, and therefore to users belonging to these groups. So as an example, let's say that we want to create a particular view that we are going to call my read view for read access. In this case, it makes perfect sense to provide access to most of the tree with this particular view. In the same example, we can create another particular view that we are going to define as my write view for write access, and in this case, this view will only provide write access to a particular branch of the tree. And let's say that we want to create another view for notifications that we are going to call my notify view that will also provide access to the whole tree. So in order to put all of these together, we will use the command snmp server group, the name of my group, and then what will be the view that will grant me read access, what will be the view that will grant me write access, and will be the view that will grant me notifications. Now let's say that you don't want to create views, you are too busy, you think views are too complex. For that matter, Catalyst 9000s have a couple of views already created by default. The most important one is the V1 default view. This view defines almost all of the tree, everything that exists below the ISO node with a few branch exceptions. So you can use that. Just a note here, by default, if you don't provide views settings for your group, the V1 default view will get assigned to your group for reading permissions. That means that every group that you create, if you don't provide further details, will have read-only permissions to the tree. So let's say that you want to grant your group permissions to almost all the tree with default views. So you will use the command snmp server group, the name of your group, and for read, write, and notify operations, you can use the V1 default view that provides access to almost all of the tree with a few exceptions. Now, in order to actually create a view, we are going to use the command snmp server view, the name of the view. You can use several commands using the same view name in order to specify how you need to create this particular view. You can add branches to your view with the include parameter, and you can exclude branches from your view using the exclude parameter. The easiest example of a view will be a view that includes most of the tree, so we will use snmp server view, the name of our view, and we will use the node name ISO and then include it. So this means that this view is going to include everything below the ISO node. In this other example, we are creating a particular view that will only include a particular branch of the object ID tree. In this particular example, we're creating a view that includes 2 branches of the object ID tree. Let's talk now about the ENGINEID. This is a hexadecimal number that uniquely identifies each remote device or agent. It is used to generate keys for authentication and privacy. It is automatically generated, for instance, using the MAC address of the device to guarantee uniqueness. However, we may set it for Catalyst 9000. We must provide at least 10 hexadecimal digits when configuring it manually. We can change it, for instance, in a remote case where we find a duplicate ID, and this is the command in order to configure it. Now, when it comes to configuring groups, we need to provide at least the security level. If we use the parameter no auth, we are aiming at no authentication, no privacy. If we use the parameter auth, we are aiming at authentication, no privacy. And if we use the parameter priv, we are aiming at authentication, privacy. It is highly recommended to add an access control list for each group so we can maintain a control over what are the IP addresses that can communicate with this agent. It is also highly recommended to configure views for read operations, write operations, and notification operations. We can create custom views or use the views that are already created by default. Now, regarding user configuration, the user configuration must abide by the security level of the group that this user belongs to. So for no authentication, no privacy, the user configuration must not include any algorithm or password. For users that belong to authentication, no privacy groups, these users must provide an authentication algorithm such as MD5 or SHA and an authentication password. And for users that belong to groups that are configured as authentication and privacy, these users' configuration must provide an authentication algorithm, a privacy algorithm, an authentication password, and a privacy password. Now, we can also assign a particular access control list to a particular user. If the group already has an access control list, the user access control list will override whatever we configured at the group level. Now, these are examples of how to configure version 3 with the minimal configuration. One user, one group, one user, one group, one user, one group. In the case of no authentication, no privacy, we're going to use this parameter for the group, and the user is not going to provide any password or algorithm at all. For authentication, no privacy, we're going to use this parameter, and the user is going to provide an authentication algorithm and an authentication password. For authentication privacy, we're going to use this parameter for the group, and the user must provide an authentication algorithm, an authentication password, a privacy algorithm, and a privacy password. Now, these are examples of how to configure Snmp version 3 the recommended way. We are configuring a read view, a write view, and a notify view at the group level. And we are also adding an access control list for the group, and optionally we can add an access control list for the user. Now, in order to configure traps for version 3, first we have to choose whether we want to generate all the available traps in this system or a particular set of traps. Then we have to choose to send all the traps to a particular network management system with the command Snmp server host trap version 3, or a particular list of traps to a particular network management system. We need to provide the security level, no authentication, no privacy, authentication, no privacy, or authentication privacy. We need to provide an appropriate username that must be configured in the network management system. Now, to configure informs, we have to go through 3 stages. In the first stage, we need to configure how many pending informs we want to maintain in memory, how many retries per inform, and what is the timeout per retry. Then we must choose whether to create all the available informs in the system or particular informs. And then we need to choose whether to send all the generated informs to a particular host or a list of particular informs to a particular network management system. We are going to use the command Snmp server host, the IP address, and informs version 3. We need to provide the security level and the username. Now let's talk about a Cisco feature that is known as Snmp support for VPNs, that is also known as VPN context-based control. Remember that in a Cisco device you can create VRFs, where each VRF will have its own settings, its own read, its own set of interfaces. So what if you want to gather information that comes from a particular VRF? So in this case, you can use this feature. There are MIPS that are VRF aware. In order to know what are the MIPS that are VRF aware within your device, you can use this command, show Snmp MIP context. We know for sure that these MIPS are MIP aware because they have been available since several years ago. So the idea here is that when you gather information for a particular VRF, for a particular MIP, the information will be different if you change the VRF.